Chapter 7 of Giacomo Puccini by Wakeling Dry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. La Bohème. The mere fact that La Bohème, Puccini's fourth work, to which he gave the plain title of opera, is his most popular composition for the stage, makes one all the more inclined to search more minutely for weaknesses. But with repeated performances, for it has passed into the regular repertory of all opera houses wherever it has been played, its unity, both as an idea and an expression, comes out more and more with remarkable distinctness. It captured the Italian ear and taste immediately, and babies were christened Mimi and Rodolfo, just as years before Santuzza and Turiddu, culled from Mascagni's Cavalleria Rusticana, were favorite baptismal appellations. It did not take long for England, represented in this instance by the comparatively limited number of opera lovers, to take it to its heart. It delighted fastidious France, and even satisfied hypercritical and essentially conservative Germany. Of all Puccini's work, it exhibits, perhaps, the most spontaneity, and as a piece of modern music, if the melodies themselves, apart from their very definite piquancy and freshness, do not rise to any vast heights of emotional expression, its absolute continuity is certainly a very high artistic achievement, and stands unquestionably as its most striking feature. Illica and Giocosa provided the book, and their idea in providing the framework is clearly indicated by the prefatory note to the vocal score. They begin with a quotation from the preface to Murger's Vie de Bohème, of which the thoroughly impressionistic opera is a most spirited musical expression. The Bohemians, under which title the opera was first presented in England, does not express by any means the exact nature of the work. It is the spirit of Bohemianism, that curious, almost undefinable quality, which in reality simply means the absolute living for and in the mood of the moment, and is not by any means the entire monopoly of the artistic temperament, that is portrayed by the dramatic scheme. In the matter of following Murger's story, which as a novel is the most free in the whole range of modern literature, the librettists have been careful to give the spirit rather than the letter. They even rolled two characters, Francine and Mimi, into one, for they find that although in Murger's book characters of each person are clearly defined, one and the same temperament bears different names and is incarnated, so to speak, in two different persons. Who cannot detect, they say, in the delicate profile of one woman the personality both of Mimi and Francine? Who, as he reads of Mimi's little hands, whiter than those of the Goddess of Ease, is not reminded of Francine's little muff? The librettists were content to string together four more or less detached scenes from the story. Save for the death of Mimi at the close, there is no real climax to any of the four acts. In the first act, the two chief characters go off and sing their final high note in the passage. In the third, where they part more in sorrow than in anger, the situation is varied between a similar device of finishing the duet off or by quietly sitting up at the back of the scene. These two, out of many points of subtlety, are mentioned merely as showing Puccini's mastery in catching the essential spirit of the dramatic scheme, which is atmospheric or purely impressionistic. The supremacy of his art is shown in a very marked way by the preservation of the continuity of the idea by the musical expression. In this, La Bohème stands as a very notable modern work, solely because of its absolute keeping to the idea which dominates it. Leoncavallo set the same story to music, writing the book himself. As a mere adaptation of a novel for stage purposes, the dramatic portion of this opera, which keeps the stage in France and Germany, may be pointed to as offering certain points of superiority. But the music is certainly not atmospheric or impressionistic, and the two works never really come into rivalry. Puccini's La Bohème is absolutely on its own plane, and in its own particular way supreme. La Bohème was composed partly at Torre del Lago and partly in a villa which Puccini took for a time at Castellaccio near Pescia. It was given for the first time at the Teatro Regio, Turin, on February 1, 1896, Toscanini being the conductor, and the cast as follows: Rodolfo, Gorga, Marcello, Wilmant, Schaunard, Pinicorsi, Colline, Mazzara, Benoit and Alcindoro, Polonini, Mimi, Ferrani, Musetta, Passini. Its first appearance in England was interesting from the rare fact that a new opera should not only be produced within a year of its production in its native land, but that an English company should be the first to present it in our native tongue. With the title The Bohemians, it was given at Manchester on April 22, 1897, at the Theatre Royal, by the Carl Rosa Company, conducted by Claude Jacquenet, and the cast as follows: Rodolfo, Robert Cunningham, Marcello, William Paul, Schaunard, Charles Tilbury, Colline, Arthur Winkworth, Mimi, Alice Esty, Musetta, Bessie MacDonald. It was given at Covent Garden in English in the October of the same year, with practically the same cast. Madame Alice Esty, from whom I learnt several interesting particulars not only of the production of the opera, but of the work in general, and some of the past history of the wonderful organization which is still doing such excellent work in keeping alive the love for opera in English, was the first English Mimi, although she was born in Boston. There were many difficulties in the production, and, strange to say, the part of Mimi was first offered to Mademoiselle Zélie de Lussan, the well-known exponent of the part of Carmen not only in English but in French as well. The photograph of Madame Alice Esty shows her in the last act of La Bohème, and it will be noticed that she wears, not the customary black gown of the little seamstress, but one of some pretensions to magnificence. She followed, she told me, the idea of the composer, who particularly wished to bring out the fact that Mimi, after parting with Rodolfo, had formed an alliance with a rich viscount. This little incident, it will be remembered, is duly referred to by Musetta in the text. I have also talked with Puccini about this first English performance of La Bohème. "I always feel about past performances," he said, "in the same way as dead people. Let us say nothing about them but good. But I shall never forget the shock it was to me on arriving at the theatre to find the disposition of the orchestra in a fashion which I have never seen except at a circus. Out of two boxes at each end, the bass brass on the one side and the drum on the other gave forth detached blares and pops which really frightened the life out of me. They did not seem to have anything to do with the general music scheme. I heard this band rehearsal start, and then I saw the right idea, simply because of the square cut idea as to the tempi on the part of the conductor was absolutely away from the spirit of the work. I asked the band to take a rest, and then took 2 rehearsals with the piano myself. It was not long before the artists, all of them sincerely concerned with the proper interpretation of my ideas, and myself got into complete accord. I was very pleased on the whole with the way it eventually went, and although I did not see the subsequent London production, Ricordi told me that the Manchester performance was far more spontaneous. How wonderfully Puccini is able, by playing a score of his on the piano and by his eloquent directions as to interpretation, to convey his subtlest meaning to an artist. I can speak from actual knowledge. I have heard him take a singer through a good deal of this very opera. Under his almost magical hands, a well-learned interpretation is transformed into a genuinely spontaneous interpretation. Puccini, in the present year of grace, when I told him that I had seen an important opera revived in the provinces with the same strange disposal of the orchestra which had caused him such distress, threw back his head and roared with laughter, not in the least unkindly. "You are a delightful people and seriously artistic, but you will keep on doing such funny things." For a long time, however, Mademoiselle Melba, who in this country has invariably, since her first performance of the part in Italian here, been seen in the character, has appeared in the final scene in much the same plain dress as in the opening act, the reason, doubtless, being that Mimi's loneliness and poverty should be emphasized. Lately, however, Mademoiselle Melba has reverted to the original method of dressing the part, and appears in the last scene in an even more elaborate evening gown of pale blue satin, with a cloak, and dispenses with a hat. La Bohème was brought to London after its first production, as we have seen, and was played about 20 times that season. The Covent Garden production in Italian was 2 years later, on June 30th, 1899, when Mancinelli conducted, the cast being as follows: Rodolfo, De Lucia; Marcello, Ancona; Schaunard, Gilbert; Collins, Journet; Benoit and Alcindoro, Dufriche; Mimi, Melba; Musetta, Zélie de Lussan. It will be noted that the gifted lady who was in the mind of the Carl Rosa authorities for their initial production as Mimi was then seen in the particular part for which her temperament fitted her. By substituting Caruso as the Rodolfo it is one of the very finest parts of this tenor and Scotti as the Marcello, we have practically the same cast as that with which this opera at the present time fills Covent Garden, invariably one of its most brilliant audiences. In June, 1898, Paris saw La Bohème at the Opéra Comique, for which performance the composer visited the French capital for the first time to superintend some of the first rehearsals. It went to America in the December of the same year, when it was mounted at the Academy of Music, Philadelphia, and sung in Italian. Melba was the Mimi, De Lussan the Musetta, and Pandolfini the Rodolfo. New York had seen it, in English, at the American Theatre in the previous month. This production, in which the Rodolfo was J. F. Sheehan, the Mimi Yvonne de Treville, and the Musetta Villa Knox, was by Henry W. Savage's Castle Square Opera Company. It was given in French at New Orleans in the winter of 1900 by Barrick's Company. It was given in Germany at the An der Rhen Theatre, Vienna, Francis Saville being the Mimi and Franz Naval the Rodolfo. Coming to the story, which with the music is by this time so familiar to opera goers, the composer, in characteristic fashion, plunges us at once, without scarcely as much as a few bars of prelude, into the midst of things. At the outset the atmosphere is established by the restless, vivacious, detached and spirited phrase which, if it hardly ever assumes the proportions, musically considered, of a leading theme, at least flavors very strongly the whole musical fabric. It may well be taken to represent the free, unrestrained spirit of the vie de Bohème. The curtain rises quickly, and we see an attic, inhabited by the quartet of gay spirits, those bold adventurers, as Murger calls them, who are stopped by nothing, rain or dust, cold or heat. Every day's existence is a work of genius, a daily problem. Now abstemious as anchorites, now riding forth on the most ruinous fancies, not finding enough windows whence to throw their money. Truly, as Murger puts it, a gay life, yet a terrible one. Rodolfo, the poet, gazes pensively out of the window. Marcello, the artist, is painting the passage of the Red Sea. It is Christmas Eve, and the cold is bitter, and to keep the stove alight they burn up a manuscript, a drama, of Rodolfo's. All through this scene of colloquial and snappy dialogue, the music runs with remarkable movement. Soon Schaunard the musician comes in. He has been lucky enough not only to find a job but to get paid for it, and he tells us it was an Englishman who employed him. He has bought provisions with the spoil, and they spread the feast in true Bohemian fashion with a newspaper for the tablecloth. They begin the meal with light-hearted merriment, when the landlord comes in to collect his much overdue rent. That worthy is amazed to find his tenants can pay it, and after taking a glass with them, and chatting about his amours, the four irresponsibles get rid of him. They then decide on a visit to the Café Momus in the Latin Quarter, and leave Rodolfo behind for a space, as he has to finish an article for the Beaver. "Be quick then," says Marcello, "and cut the Beaver's tail short." As Rodolfo sits at the table to work, a timid knock is heard at the door, and Mimi, the pretty little seamstress who occupies a room near the roof, and who is already in the grip of the fell disease, consumption, comes in to ask for a light, her candle having been extinguished by the draught in the passage. She is evidently worn out by cough, cold, and fatigue, and Rodolfo, after reviving her with a little wine, makes a remark as to her delicate beauty. Mimi, however, has not come to chatter or be flattered, and with thanks prettily expressed, she departs for her chamber. Fate, in the shape of a lost key, sends her back again, and the draught in the passage puts out not only Mimi's candle but Rodolfo's as well. While they both search for the key, Mimi's cold little hand touches that of Rodolfo, and the latter clasps it, and he then tells her of his life and aims and prospects in the beautifully melodious number Che gelida manina, which, like so many of Puccini's themes, seems to grow out of the reiteration of a single note, swelling out in a delightful emotional fullness. Mimi tells Rodolfo of her work, and how she embroiders flowers on rich stuffs, which make her think of the green fields and the sweet scents of the countryside; how lonely she is all by herself in her little top attic; how she takes her frugal supper all alone. The two natures are quickly brought together, and Mimi is soon in Rodolfo's arms, and has received his first passionate kiss. The three friends outside now call up to him, and he says he has 3 lines to finish, but that he will join them anon, and that he wants 2 places kept at the supper table. With a full confession of her love, Mimi takes Rodolfo's arm, and their last notes, my love, are heard as they descend the staircase. At the Café Momus, the exterior of which we see as the curtain rises on the second act, preceded by a clever and vivacious phrase given to the trumpets in the orchestra, our 4 brave Bohemians were known as the Four Musketeers, since they were inseparable. Indeed, says Murger, they always went about together, played together, dined together, often without paying the bill, yet always with a beautiful harmony worthy of the Conservatoire orchestra. In this scene, which is full of life and movement, showing in the treatment of the chorus, formed of children, people, soldiers, students, work girls, and gendarmes, that beautifully polished technique in melodic construction which makes Puccini so strong and in every way a master musician, the lively Musetta comes on the scene. Once more may Murger's own words fittingly recall her to mind. Mademoiselle Musetta was a pretty girl of 20, very coquettish, rather ambitious, but without any pretensions to spelling. Oh, those delightful suppers, a perpetual alternative between a blue brougham and an omnibus, between the Rue Breda and the Latin Quarter. Although the incidents represented appear to follow consecutively, it is a little strange to find a sort of al fresco entertainment in progress after the references to the bitter cold in the preceding act. At any rate, whether the dramatist's license be allowed or not, and we may easily imagine a flight of time to have taken place since the happenings in the opening act, the Café Momus in this second act is so full that our quartet of Bohemians, with Musetta and her elderly admirer, take their supper en plein air. There is little of incident or progress of events in this lively scene. Musetta is reconciled, after singing her delicious song, in slow waltz form, to her Marcello, and the fatuous old Alcindoro is left to pay the bill of the whole party. Yet against this, the sense of movement and gaiety shown by the ever-moving crowd, and the incident of the toy seller Parpignol, just a plain slice of life put down on the stage in a truly modern method, is beautifully worked out in the music, and never for an instant does it flag in vivacity. Musetta comes into prominence again in the third act. Again is the weather intensely cold, and the chill, drear atmosphere is indicated in the music at the opening by the subtle passage of bare fifths, which is further remarkable, as a purely musical effect, from its connection with the trumpet passage which heralded the second act. The scene is a place beyond the toll gate, on the Orleans road, at the end of the Rue d'Enfer. Over a tavern hangs Marcello's picture as a signboard, with its title altered to the port of Marseilles, signifying its adaptation to the environment. 2 scenes of parting dominate the dramatic plan of this act, that of Rodolfo and Mimi, and that of Marcello and Musetta. They are cleverly contrasted. Very pathetically does Mimi's Addio senza rancor come from the depths of her simple little heart, while the end is foreshadowed by the hacking cough which frequently chokes her utterances. Musetta is taken to task by Marcello for flirting, and off she goes after a strongly dramatic duet, which for characterization and force is one of the most distinctive numbers in the opera. And after her exit, in a fury, Mimi and Rodolfo appear to agree, indicated by the last phrases of their tender duet, to continue together for yet a space in the old relations. In the fourth act we are back in the attic, and the quartet of Bohemians are once more struggling with the problem of keeping body and soul together. Two of them, Rodolfo and Marcello, at any rate, are lonely, for Mimi has been taken up by a viscount, and Musetta, dressed in velvet, through which, as Rodolfo tells Marcello, she cannot hear her heart beat, is riding in a carriage. But with all their troubles they keep a stout heart, and are able to jest over the herring and rolls which Schaunard and Colline bring in for dinner. They dance and romp and play the fool in the lightest hearted manner, until Musetta suddenly breaks in upon their pretended jollity. The end is reached rapidly. Mimi has come home to die, and this she does after an intensely sad, simple, and moving scene, stretched, as they placed her, on Rodolfo's hard little bed. Infinitely touching is Mimi's reference, in her last words, to the song which Rodolfo sang in the opening act. She begins Che gelida manina, only to break off in a fit of coughing. Marcello has gone out to fetch a doctor, and Musetta brings a muff to warm the dying girl's fingers. Mimi's spirit passes away, however, before aid can be brought to her, and the pathos of the situation is intensified by the silence in which it takes place. It is Schaunard who whispers to Marcello that she is dead. To Rodolfo's last despairing cry of "Mimi, Mimi," as he realizes that his loved one is no more, does the curtain fall. There is little to point to in the music save its chief and outstanding feature, its continuity. In this the whole charm and strength of the work lies. Orchestrally, the score of La Bohème is a beautifully polished one, not so symphonically complete as Manon, for instance, but essentially individual. For fullness as a constructional background, one may point to the orchestration of the duet in the first act; for daintiness of effect, the use of harmonics on the harp against the muted strings in Musetta's waltz song; while many happy touches are seen all through, such as the xylophone and muted trumpets at the toy seller's entrance in the café scene; or again, the striking passage in fifths at the opening of the third act, given to the harp and flutes over the 'cellos playing tremolo. The orchestra employed is the usual large modern orchestra, with a piccolo, glockenspiel, and xylophone. Considerable use is also made of the division of the 'cellos, in many places, into three. The complete success, notwithstanding certain difficulties that have been referred to, of the first performance of the opera in this country, was duly chronicled in London, on the day following the event, in the Times. The notice states that the composer was called at the end and bowed his acknowledgments, from which it would appear that he was prevailed upon at least to appear on the fall of the curtain, although by all accounts I have heard, from those who took part in the performance, Puccini adopted the custom, followed, if we may believe certain traditions, by certain notable playwrights, of wandering up and down the streets until the première was over. The writer of the notice in question places the work on a higher level than Manon, speaks of the highly dramatic intensity reached by simple means in the scenes between Mimi and Rodolfo, notices in the absence of set songs the Wagnerian method of continuous melody, and sums it up as a decided success, gained by the beauty of its melody, the refinement of the music as a whole, the cleverness in the handling of the themes, and by the absence of claptrap. The performance is spoken of as a genuine triumph, in spite of the leading tenor's hoarseness. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Giacomo Puccini by Wakeling Dry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Tosca. With his next opera, For Tosca is the only one of his works so entitled by the composer. Puccini made a rather curious reversal of the proceedings as compared with La Bohème, taking it from an Italian story treated from the French point of view. From the old world story of Murger, Puccini turned to a notable example of modern French stagecraft in Sardou's drama of La Tosca. His librettists, again, were Giocosa and Illica, and they provided the composer with a strikingly apt presentation of the grim story. Not one, perhaps, that lends itself altogether to musical expression, but one which certainly grips the attention and carries the hearer along. By Tosca, Puccini certainly sustained his now universal popularity made manifest by the preceding La Bohème. It was given first at the Costanzi Theatre, Rome, on January 14, 1900, conducted by Mugnone and cast as follows: Tosca, Darclay; Cavaradossi, De Marchi; Scarpia, Giraldin; Angelotti, Galli; the sacristan, Borelli. London saw it in the summer of the same year at Covent Garden, where it was given on July 12 with the following cast, Mancinelli being the conductor: Tosca, Ternina; Cavaradossi, De Lucia; Scarpia, Scotti; Angelotti, Dufriche; the sacristan, Gilbert. In America, Tosca was first given in Italian on February 4, 1901, at the Metropolitan Opera House, New York, by Maurice Grau's company, the cast and conductor being the same as that for the first Covent Garden performance, with the substitution of Cremonini for De Lucia as Cavaradossi. Its first American production in English was by Henry W. Savage's company, at the Tech Theatre, Buffalo, and cast as follows, Emanuel being the conductor: Tosca, Adelaide Norwood; Cavaradossi, Joseph Sheehan; Scarpia, W. Goff; Angelotti, F. J. Boyle; the sacristan, Francis Carrier. In the music of Tosca, Puccini reveals, more powerfully perhaps than anywhere, the quick instinct of the theatre which may be called dramatic, or merely a very clever fitting of music to the mood of the moment. It is, in fact, very purely melodramatic, the word being used here not in its accepted sense of the traditional tootle tootle in the orchestra when the wicked villain pursues the innocent and sorely tried heroine. The story is tragic in all conscience, but it hardly reaches the level of true tragedy, since it is more horrible than impressive, and lacks that restraint and poetry which are two necessary qualities. This much must be said for the operatic version. It is a shade less revolting, less purely realistic than the drama, and it undoubtedly provides a splendid acting role for the exponent of the name part, while the lover and the villain, Scarpia, the chief of police, are provided with opportunities, very little behind, in point of vocal and dramatic effect. One could very well imagine a production, on prevailing lines set upon elaboration of detail, in which Puccini's music, or a great deal of it, was used purely as incidental music. This suggestion, however, must in no way be taken to mean that, as a whole, the music of this opera lacks continuity of interest, or fails to exhibit the close and essential union between speech and song. There are many pages of strong and definite lyrical charm, but somehow the main interest lies in the action which fascinates the spectator, rather, one feels, against his better, or more calm, judgment. It is, in short, a most moving picture of love, hate, jealousy, passion, and intrigue. These, after all, form the great bulk of the material for operatic treatment, and without entering into the question whether Tosca is or is not a work for all time, it has certain very live attributes which make it a notable achievement. The scene in the first act shows the Attavanti Chapel in the church of St. Andrea della Valle in Rome. The strenuous, shuddering chords which preface the short prelude are representative of the cruel nature of Scarpia, whose personality dominates the scene. More than this, the figure seems to give at once the atmosphere of stress, and hints at a wealth of incident which characterizes the whole of that which is to follow. A man in prison garb, harassed, disheveled, well nigh breathless with fear and haste, comes in and glances hastily this way and that. This is Angelotti, a victim of papal tyranny, who has escaped from the castle of Sant'Angelo, and his entrance, it will be noted, is also characterized by a theme always associated with him throughout the work. On the pillar is an image of the Virgin, and underneath it a stoup. "My sister wrote to tell me of this spot," says Angelotti, as he searches for the key which will open the chapel and allow him to escape. While he searches in feverish haste, the string of chromatic chords carries on the idea of his agitation. With yet another glance to reassure himself that he has not been followed, he opens the gate in the grille of the chapel and disappears. A light tripping figure ushers in the sacristan, and it continues for a space while he walks to the dais, on which is an easel and a covered picture. He complains of the bother he has in washing the brushes of the artist who is painting an altarpiece. He is surprised not to find Cavaradossi painting. The Angelus rings, and the sacristan kneels and continues the prayer. Cavaradossi now comes in, and a broad melodious phrase is heard as he ascends the dais and uncovers the picture. The sacristan is amazed to find that it represents the features of a lady who has been frequently to pray in the church, and is further shocked when the artist draws forth a miniature and compares it with his figure, into whose features he has incorporated the dusky glow and peach-like bloom of his beloved Floria. The phrase indicated at Cavaradossi's entrance now swells out in a lyrical melody, in which he sings that his Madonna's eyes are blue, while Tosca's are dark as a moonless night, the sacristan punctuating the rhapsody with a pious ejaculation, to the effect that the artist scorns the saints and jests with the ungodly. After the sacristan's departure to a snatch of his characteristic phrase, Angelotti, believing the church empty, comes out of the chapel. Cavaradossi does not at first recognize in this prison-worn creature his friend, the Council of the Republic. Tosca's voice is heard, and the artist makes a sign to Angelotti to remain yet a little while in hiding, and on hearing that the fugitive is spent with hunger, he gives him the basket left for his refreshment by the sacristan. A quick-moving figure, accompanied by triplets, announces Tosca's entrance, and she thinks that she has heard her lover conversing with another woman, and even declares she heard the swish of skirts. Cavaradossi attempts to embrace her, but she reproves him, and first makes an offering before the Virgin's shrine. This done, she tells him that, although she is singing at the theatre that evening, the piece is a short one, and proceeds to sing in a delightfully suave melody, which increases gradually in intensity, of the delights of love in a quiet, secluded cottage far away from all worldly distractions. Cavaradossi comes in at the close with an impassioned burst on a characteristic high note, in which he says that he is caught in the toils of her enchantment. The artist makes as his excuse for her quick dismissal the need of continuing his work on the picture, but his frequent glances towards the chapel show that his anxiety for his friend is the cause of his agitation. But Tosca now comes in sight of the picture, and is struck by the resemblance of the face to someone she has seen. She immediately connects the whispering she has heard before arriving upon the scene, and the anxious looks towards the chapel, together as a proof that Cavaradossi has been meeting the original of the picture. The incident, however, leads up to a further avowal of devotion on the part of Cavaradossi, and their voices blend together for a brief space in a delicious bit of melody. Tosca elects to be comforted, and with a final thrust she goes out, requesting her lover to change the lady's eyes to black ones. Angelotti now comes out of the chapel, and tells of his plan of escape. Cavaradossi gives him the key of his villa, and indicates the way he may reach it. Angelotti takes up the bundle of clothes left by his sister for his disguise, the sister being the lady who has been frequenting the church of late, and who has attracted the artist's attention, and goes off, while his friend tells him, as a final precaution in case of urgent need, of a passage that leads down to a cellar. Just as Angelotti is going, the cannons sound from the fortress, giving the signal that the prisoner's escape has been discovered. On their exit, the sacristan enters, followed by choir boys, acolytes, and a crowd of people. The sacristan tells them the news of Bonaparte's defeat, that there will be rejoicings and a new cantata for the occasion sung by Tosca, and his snatch of melody is cleverly derived from the theme heard on his first entrance. The choir boys burst out into a great riot of joyous merrymaking, beginning with Te Deum and Gloria, and breaking out into Long Live the King, the sacristan trying his best to drive them into the sacristy to vest for the festival service. Their jollity is cut short by the entrance of Scarpia, whose sinister theme breaks in characteristically, as always, followed by Spoletta and others of his staff. After bidding them curtly prepare for the solemn Te Deum, he motions the rather frightened sacristan to his side, and tells him that a state prisoner has escaped, and from information received has been tracked here. He asks which is the Attavanti chapel, and the facts that the gate is open and that a new key is in the lock give at once a clue. A police agent comes out of the chapel and brings with him the basket given to Angelotti by Cavaradossi, and Scarpia, after a little more judicious questioning of the sacristan, is able to guess that the fugitive has been assisted by the painter. Tosca now comes back, and after signalling to the sacristan, Scarpia retires behind a pillar, watching her as she looks about for Cavaradossi. To serve his own ends, he decides to rouse the jealousy of the woman, and after a little flattery, expressed in a suave, flowing melody, he brings out a fan, and mildly inquires whether it forms any part of the customary outfit of a painter. From the coronet on it, Tosca recognizes it as belonging to the Marchioness Attavanti, who is the sister of Angelotti, and a member of the family to whom the chapel is dedicated. Forgetful of Scarpia's presence and the place where she is, Tosca, in a finely emotional passage, broken into now and again by Scarpia, who rams home his poisonous suggestions, bewails the weakness of her lover. And the wily Scarpia, after tenderly escorting her to the church door, dispatches an agent to watch her closely. His exultation at having fired her jealousy is punctuated twice by the sound of cannon, and into the rather curious triplet accompaniments is worked the opening phrases of the organ, which signals the approach of the procession of the chapter, with the Cardinal, to whom Scarpia makes a reverence as he passes him. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who hath made heaven and earth, sing the chapter and monks, while Scarpia continues his musings as to the business he has on hand. From the mere catching of the escaped prisoners, his thoughts turn to lustful possession of Tosca, and the whole scene, finely contrasted, is worked up with superb force into one of those magnificently solid finales which reveal the technique of Puccini so emphatically. The cannon continue to go off. The sound is managed, by the way, by striking a huge cone over which is stretched, drum fashion, a tight skin. The whole crowd turn towards the high altar, the stately Te Deum swells through the church, and at the end, Scarpia, after saying that for Tosca he would renounce his hopes of heaven, joins in the last phrase, "All the earth shall worship thee, the Father everlasting." The curtain descends quickly to the harsh progression of chords forming the Scarpia theme. The second act shows us Scarpia's room in the Farnese Palace. It is on an upper floor. To the left a table is laid, and at the back a large window looks over the courtyard. Scarpia is at supper, and looks at his watch from time to time impatiently. Tosca is a famous decoy, he sings. Tomorrow's sunrise shall see the two conspirators hanging side by side on my tallest gallows. Ringing a handbell, which is answered by Sciarrone, he inquires whether Tosca is in the palace, and learns that she has been summoned thither. Scarpia orders the window to be thrown open, and borne on the evening air comes the sound of a gavotte from the orchestra, which is playing in one of the lower rooms at an entertainment given by Queen Caroline. Very skilfully is this graceful little melody, just sufficiently archaic in its mould to be characteristic of the period, used as a background for the clever dialogue which follows, from which we learn that Tosca is to be lured to the palace in hope of seeing Cavaradossi. Spoletta comes in to give an account of his visit to the villa, and enrages Scarpia by telling him of Angelotti's escape. The minister is somewhat mollified when Spoletta tells him that he promptly secured the painter. Now, with striking effect, the dance measure gives place to a cantata, proving that Tosca is in the palace in the Queen's apartments. Scarpia's directions as to securing Cavaradossi are worked into the musical fabric with consummate effect, and continue as the painter, now a prisoner, is led in. Cavaradossi breaks off from his curt and guarded replies to Scarpia's questioning on hearing Tosca's voice. He denies strenuously that Angelotti received any aid from him, and even laughs at his examiner. Scarpia shuts the window in anger, and the repetition of his characteristic similar phrase leads up to a strenuous passage in which determination is skilfully depicted in contrast to the almost colloquial movement of the preceding passages. "Once more," says Scarpia, "where is Angelotti?" And from a remark by Spoletta, the application of the process torture to wring a confession from the prisoner is hinted at. Tosca now enters, and runs quickly to her lover, who tells her, quickly in an undertone, not to say a word of what she has seen at the villa. As Scarpia signals to Sciarrone to slide back the panel which leads to the torture chamber, he says formally, "Mario Cavaradossi, the judge is wanting to take your depositions." Sciarrone then gives the directions to Roberto, an underling, to at first apply the usual pressure and to increase it as he will direct him. Then follows a highly dramatic scene, ushered in with a characteristic theme indicating the torture which Tosca's lover is to undergo, between Scarpia and Tosca, in which the latter dismisses the fan episode as a feeble trick to rouse her jealousy. Scarpia, however, comes very quickly to plain speaking, and tells Tosca that she had better confess all she knows as to the escape of Angelotti, if she wishes to spare Cavaradossi an hour of anguish. Tosca learns with horror that a fillet of steel, gradually tightening round the temples, is being applied to Cavaradossi's head, and on hearing his groan of pain, she relents, and bursts out that she will speak if he is released. But Mario, from within, calls on Tosca to be silent, and that he despises the pain. Scarpia directs further pressure to be applied. Tosca is allowed to gaze through the open door, and, distracted by what she sees, signifies her intention of revealing all she knows. Her mind is made up, when she hears another groan of anguish, and she tells Scarpia that Angelotti is to be found in the well in the garden of the villa. Scarpia now orders Cavaradossi to be brought in. From Scarpia's directions to Spoletta, the fainting victim, nearly at his last gasp by what he has endured, learns of Tosca's treachery, and curses her. This painful scene, finely worked up as it is in intensity, comes to a climax by the news brought in by Sciarrone of the victory at Marengo by Bonaparte. This enrages Scarpia, but he will, at least, keep the victim he has in hand, and Cavaradossi, exulting as he foresees the downfall of the minister, is borne off. Tosca now turns to Scarpia and implores him to save Cavaradossi. Splendidly dramatic is the closing scene, beginning with Scarpia's light and airy remark that his little supper was interrupted, and rising to heights of emotional fullness when Tosca asks him outright to name his price for saving her lover's life. Tosca's horrified scream, to a rising passage of two high notes, when she listens to Scarpia's lascivious proposals, thoroughly fits the situation. The drums are used cleverly to indicate the march of the prisoners to their doom, and the setting up of the gallows for Cavaradossi, and in contrast to Scarpia's sinister passages, comes the broad, lyrical, and impassioned prayer of Tosca, who rails at God for having forsaken her in her hour of need. Scarpia presses his infamous proposals when Spoletta returns, and speaking outside brings the news that Angelotti has poisoned himself rather than allow himself to be taken. A question as to the disposal of Cavaradossi brings the climax, and Tosca, by taking upon herself to give directions as to this, indicates her consent to Scarpia's wishes. But this master of deceit will not allow the release to be managed in any but his own way. He tells Spoletta that there will be an execution, but it will be a sham one, as in the case of another prisoner by name Palmieri, the guns being loaded with blank cartridge only, and the victim instructed to fall and feign death. But Tosca wants more than this on her side of the bargain. Scarpia must give them both a passport out of the place. And as he goes to the table to write it, Tosca's eyes catch sight of a knife on the table. In an instant her mind is made up, and as he returns to give her the paper and to clasp her in a feverish embrace, she plunges the knife into his heart. The death scene is perhaps a little prolonged, but seeing that it has been preceded by the torturing of Cavaradossi, it is at least logical that Tosca should remind him of the ghastly torture he inflicted on her loved one. The intensity of the scene is rounded off by the expressive phrase, on a low monotone, of Tosca: "And yesterday all Rome lay at this man's feet." The action to the finishing notes of this moving scene follows that of the play. Tosca searches for the passport and snatches it from the fast locking palms of the dead man. With a shudder, she rinses her finger with a serviette dipped in the carafe, and then puts the candles from the supper table at the head of the corpse, and taking a crucifix from the wall, places it on the breast, as the Scarpia theme, in long drawn chords, is played softly by the orchestra. She goes out quietly as the curtain falls. The third act takes place on an open space or platform within the castle of Sant'Angelo. At the back we see the dome of St. Peter's and the Vatican. The expressive prelude and the opening song by a shepherd are musically of great interest. It begins with a horn passage, and at the rise of the curtain it is still night, and we see the dawn break, and hear the many bells from the church towers, one of the most striking sounds of the Eternal City. The pastoral melody of the shepherd has a plaintive character, and he sings: "Day now is breaking, the weary world awaking, lending new sorrow and sadness to the morrow." And the sheep bells come in with their jangle as the shepherd continues, with a suggestion of a love theme: "If you could prize me, to live I might try, but if you despise me, I may as well die." Then the church bells continue the strain, now near, now afar. A jailer enters and looks over the parapet to see if the soldiers to whom is entrusted the grim task of execution have arrived. Led by a sergeant, the picket enters, bringing Cavaradossi. The jailer, after making him sign a paper, tells him that he has an hour, and that a priest is at his disposal. Cavaradossi, after giving a ring to the jailer as the price of the favour, is allowed to write a letter, and sings his beautiful air, one of the chief lyrical gems of the opera, E lucevan le stelle. It ends emotionally, and the singer bursts into tears with the thought that never was life so dear to him as now, when he is within sight of death. Spoletta comes in bringing Tosca, and is amazed to find that she brings a safe conduct. Tosca and Cavaradossi join in a finely expressive duet, in which the latter learns of her devotion and how for him she killed Scarpia. Towards the close the voices are unsupported, and the whole number has a very characteristic force and movement. The sky has gradually been getting lighter, and the passage of time is marked by the striking of the hour of 4 by the church clock. Then Tosca gives the final instructions to the condemned man. "As soon as they fire, fall down." Cavaradossi, in his joy at his coming release, is even able to be humorous, and suggests that he will be acting like Tosca. Tosca watches the supposed execution from the parapet. "How well he acts!" she cries, after she has covered her ears with her hands to shut out the sound of the shooting, and then sees her lover prostrate on the ground. Leaning over, she calls to him: "Get up, Mario, now! Quickly away, Mario, Mario!" Then with a heart-piercing cry she learns that Scarpia has been false to the end, and that the execution has in very truth taken place. By this time the news of Scarpia's death has come out, and Spoletta naturally fixes on Tosca as the murderess. The soldiers' voices are heard joining in the hue and cry, and Sciarrone comes in to seize Tosca. Tosca, after thrusting back Spoletta nearly to the ground, hurls herself from the parapet. Her last thoughts are of the tyrant who has so cruelly wronged her, and her last words are, "O Scarpia, we shall face God together." In pure orchestration, Puccini, in Tosca, shows an advance on La Bohème, in the general symphonic fulness and in the more extended use of representative themes. The orchestra employed is the usual large orchestra of the moderns, and Puccini adds a third flute, a contrabassoon, a celesta, and for the special effects in the opening of the third act a set of bells. There are several places where more work than hitherto is obtained from the dividing of the strings, but not in any way like the Strauss method, for example, of subdividing them into several distinct groups. As will have been seen during the progress of the story, the themes stand out as invariably characteristic, and at the first entrance of Tosca the theme is delightful, given out by the flute against the plucked strings. There is excellent work by the woodwind in the impressive finale of the first act, which is mainly developed out of the bell theme. In the pastoral music at the opening of the third act, Puccini uses with characteristic force a passage of fifths, one which he is always fond of employing, and which, curiously enough, always has the effect of bringing about the special flavor of atmosphere it is intended to convey in any one particular place. In the Daily Telegraph the critic prefaces his column notice, which appeared the day after the first production, with a protest against the conjunction of a pure and beautiful art, music, with the workings of a humanity that has gone to the devil. But apart from these considerations, the writer has little but praise for the singularly lucid libretto. The first and all-important remark to make concerning the music, he proceeds, has to do with its Italian character. There is very little that can be regarded as common to it and to the typical German opera. The pedestal is not on the stage and the statue in the orchestra. Tosca does not offer us declamation as a key to symphonic music, nor symphonic music as a key to declamation. The work does not follow the old operatic lines into matter of detail. All is subordinate to the changing situations and emotions of the stage. So far Tosca is modern. For the rest, it presents the characteristics which have always distinguished Italian opera: long reaches of tender or passionate melody, intense climaxes, and a disposition to proceed everywhere on broad and direct lines to the desired goal. The charm of the light music of the first act, the beautiful soul of Cavaradossi to the picture he has painted, the piling up of the effects in the finale, the vigor of the music in the second act, particularly where Scarpia presses his suit, and the duet of the lovers at Sant'Angelo, are the points which call forth praise; while, on the other hand, the critic finds most of the music allotted to Angelotti and Scarpia dull. The notice ends with a tribute to the art of Ternina, who acted with the grace and directness of a true tragedian. Mr. Arthur Hervey, in the Morning Post, sets out, very clearly and characteristically, a plain and straightforward account of the music and story. The curious succession of chords at the opening of the prelude, the suggestion of the amorous nature of Scarpia's character by the opening notes of the second act, the pleasing effect of the gavotte heard during Scarpia's monologue, when he awaits the arrival of his spies, the beautiful song for Tosca, Visi d'arte d'amor, the beauty of the music in the last act, the ingenuity, finish, and resource of the orchestration as a whole, are points which are fully expressed by this discerning critic. With regard to the interpretation, he does not find Signor Scotti's Scarpia entirely satisfactory, while he joins in the fullest praise for Ternina's masterly performance in the name part. It ends that the opera was received with every sign of success, and that the composer, Mancinelli the conductor, and the exponents were called many times before the curtain. The Times critic makes an interesting comparison at the outset of his notice, referring to the masterly finale of the first act. The scene is one in which Meyerbeer would have delighted, but it is treated by Puccini with far greater sincerity than Meyerbeer could ever command, and with a knowledge of effect at least equal to his. With regard to the use of representative themes, the writer finds that the one associated with the passion of Scarpia, a phrase with an arpeggio in it, appears to be derived from the woman's charm in The Ring. Referring to the gavotte and cantata at the opening of the second act, the writer says that they are in excellent style and belong to the period of the action or a little before it, as it may be doubted whether the Roman composers of 1800 were capable of producing so interesting a piece of solid workmanship as the cantata, or so graceful and original a composition as the gavotte. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Giacomo Puccini by Wakeling Dry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Madamebutterfly. For his latest opera, Madamebutterfly, Puccini turned to the flowery land of Japan for the environment of a story, the book being by Illica and Giocosa, which, following his invariable custom, he chose himself. The suggestion appears to have come originally from Mr. Frank Nielsen, who was then the stage manager at Covent Garden, that Puccini should go and see the play by Belasco, running at the time at the Duke of York's Theatre in London. He did so, and was immediately taken with its possibilities. It may be mentioned as a tribute to the actors who interpreted this play, that, without knowing any English, Puccini was able to follow the story with perfect ease. He was greatly struck by Miss Evelyn Millard's performance of the name part, and her photograph as Butterfly is among his collection of celebrities at Torre del Lago. The story is a slight one, and is no more Japanese than the plot of La Bohème is French. It is a presentation of the universal theme of a man's passion, which is an episode, and a woman's love, which is her life. A little Japanese girl is wooed and won by an American naval officer. She, in her trust and devotion, regards herself, after going through some sort of marriage ceremony, as his lawful wife. He regards the whole affair as an incident, the mere satisfying of an animal instinct, and returns, married to an American wife, to find the girl a mother. The ending is the usual sad one. The girl takes her life when her dishonored state comes upon her in its full significance. Madamebutterfly was written, for the most part, during Puccini's recovery from his accident, but he had planned out a good deal of it by the end of 1902 or the beginning of the next year. He himself about this time said of the work, "As an opera it would be in one act, divided by an intermezzo. The theme has a sentiment, a passion, which veritably haunts me. I have it constantly ringing in my head." The intermezzo mentioned was Puccini's idea of treating the very effective and most eloquent silence on which, it will be remembered, the curtain fell, while the little Japanese girl with her servant and baby were keeping their long, long vigil through the night, awaiting the return of the supposed husband, who, after all, was only a lover, and a poor one at that. Puccini was at Rome for a time soon after his complete recovery from his accident, and took special pains to get up the local color for his new work. For this he invoked the aid of the Japanese ambassadress, and obtained some actual Japanese melodies from a friend of hers in Paris. Of music there is no lack in Japan, but by the Japanese themselves it is never written down. Like the troubadours of old, the musicians, who are a sort of guild, hand the traditional songs and dances on from father to son. Madamebutterfly was produced at the Scala, Milan, on February 17, 1904. Campanini was the conductor, and it was cast as follows: Butterfly, Storchio; Suzuki, Giaconia; Pinkerton, Zenatello; Sharpless, De Luca; Goro, Pinicorsi; Ziobonzo, Venturini; Jacuside, Vullmann. Although Puccini was at the very zenith of his popularity, a strange thing happened with the first production of this new opera, and the composer went through a similar experience to that which Wagner had to suffer when Tannhäuser was first given in Paris. The audience simply howled with derision. For the reason of this it is difficult to account. The storm of disapproval began after the first few bars of the opening act. Puccini very quietly took matters into his own hands, and at the end of the performance thanked the conductor for his trouble and marched off with the score. The second or any subsequent performance was therefore an impossibility. He tells an amusing story of a little incident occasioned by the fiasco, which, he says, brought him at least some little consolation and atoned for much disillusion. A bookkeeper at Genoa, an ardent admirer of Puccini, indignant at what he considered the outrageous treatment, for it was nothing else, meted out to his favorite composer, went to the city hall to register the birth of a daughter. When the clerk asked the name of the child, he replied, "Butterfly." "What," said the official, "do you want to brand your child for life with the memory of a failure?" But the father persisted, and so as Butterfly the child was entered. A little time after this Puccini heard of the incident, and, rather touched with the simple devotion, asked the father to bring the child to see him. On the appointed day Puccini looked out of the window and saw a long stream of people approaching his front door. Not only did the father bring little Butterfly, but, as in the first act of the opera from which her name was derived, her mother, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles as well, in fact the whole surviving members of the genealogical tree. Puccini laughingly said at the end of a trying afternoon that it was the most gigantic reception he had ever held. The despised opera was given in what is known as the present revised version at Brescia on 28th May of the same year, the Butterfly being Kruszyniski and Bellati the Sharpless, Zenatello being again the Pinkerton. Strange to say, it proved entirely to the taste of those who saw it. The revision, as a matter of fact, amounted to very little. It was played in 2 acts instead of 1, with the intermezzo dividing 2 scenes in the second act, making it in reality in 3 acts, and the tenor air was added in the last scene. No more striking proof of Puccini's popularity could be found than the fact that the new opera quickly came to London. It was seen at Covent Garden on July 10, 1905, Campanini being the conductor, and was cast as follows: Butterfly, Destine; Suzuki, Lejeune; Pinkerton, Caruso; Sharpless, Scotti; Goro, Dufriche; Ziobanzo, Cotroi; Jacoside, Rossi. Its splendid performance was helped, in no small degree, by the superb interpretation of the name part by Mademoiselle Destine, and the news of its favourable reception was one of the greatest pleasures ever afforded to its composer. It was given again early in the autumn season of the same year, by the company, conducted by Mugnone, who, by the way, was not the person of the same name whose death was chronicled very soon after the conclusion of the season, and for which the composer came over, having been away at Buenos Ayres when the work was given in the summer. Zenatello, who was the original Pinkerton at the Milan production, was seen in this part on this occasion, making his first appearance in London during that season. Giachetti was the Butterfly, and San Marco the Sharpless. The original source of the story, I believe, was a story by John Luther Long, and emanated from America. It was turned into a play by David Belasco, and, as in the case of The Darling of the Gods, the author's name appeared jointly with the dramatist, or adapter, on the playbills. The simple, touching little story depends rather upon pathos and atmosphere, which is decidedly poetical, than on any great dramatic situation. A lieutenant, F.B. Pinkerton, of the United States Navy, goes through a ceremony of marriage with a little Japanese girl, with no intention of regarding the contract as in the least degree binding. Little Butterfly, or Cho-Cho-san as her Japanese name is, thinks differently, and after her child is born, watches and waits anxiously for the return of her husband. Sharpless is a friend of Pinkerton's, and is the consul at Nagasaki, and he tries to break the news gently to the sorrowful girl who has been so cruelly misled, and in the letter song in the last act is provided with one of the most subtle and dramatic numbers in the whole work. Butterfly believes in Pinkerton's fidelity and honor up to the end, when her ideal is shattered by the arrival of Pinkerton's wife, an American woman, who wants to befriend the child, and who has apparently condoned Pinkerton's lapse from the strict path of virtue. Butterfly, however, prefers to die by her own hand, and this she does, after caressing the child and giving way to a torrent of grief, and pathetically placing an American flag in the baby's hand. Pinkerton comes in time to see her pass away, and in calling her name in an outburst of sorrow and remorse, the story ends. In La Bohème it has been seen how singularly happy Puccini was in stringing together, by the flow of his music, a dramatic scheme that is concerned with detached scenes and incidents, and in Madamebutterfly he is equally successful and characteristic. The music is essentially vocal, but the chief melodies are often to be found in the orchestral fabric, a feature which comes out more prominently in this work than in any of this composer's since Manon, and which goes on to prove that it stands as his chief orchestral achievement. The present work begins in a somewhat curious fashion with a tonal fugue, as if to show that the composer, with all his modernity, has still a regard for the old forms. A similar figure is used for the opening of the second act. The first indication of the Japanese character in the music, and this flavor is very sparingly introduced, comes when Goro, a sort of marriage broker, parades his wares, in the shape of girls, before the lieutenant. There is here a very distinctive melody in octaves underneath the vocal part, which is most effective. Several of the little melodies make an entrance after their first quotation, much after the fashion of the old ritornello, which is an interesting point, among several, to note in Puccini's working out, on quite modern lines, of his scheme. The themes are often altered, in place of development, by a change in the time, and at the opening of the first act several examples are to be found, while here and there an Eastern character is given to the music by the frequent use of the flat seventh. Another noteworthy feature is the constant modulation, by means of chords of the seventh. Sharpless, the friend, a baritone, makes an entry with a fine burst of melody. The theme, easily recognized on hearing the work, which is associated with this character, being one particular rhythmic distinction; and when Pinkerton, the tenor, explains that he has bought the house, and probably the little lady with it, on an elastic contract, there is a clever counterpoint in the music to the introductory fugue. Pinkerton's first chief solo the music, of course, runs on continuously from start to finish is a broad and vocal aria, quite allied to the old form. The general trend of the music gets brisker at the entry of Butterfly and her girl friends. Butterfly's first song, a beautiful largo, in which she tells of her approaching happy state, is skilfully blended with the sopranos of the chorus, and ends with a high D flat for the soloist. The procession and arrival of Butterfly's relations give an opportunity for some humor in the music, which is quaint and characteristic, and brings in a clever theme for the bassoons. Just before the signing of the contract, Butterfly has a pathetic air in which she states that, fully believing in Pinkerton, she has embraced the Christian religion and discards her native gods. Soon after, a noisy and cantankerous old uncle of the bride comes in to protest against the union. Here is another of the few examples of Japanese music, and his entry is shown by a quaint march of the conventional pattern, chiefly in unison. After the guests leave, Butterfly and Pinkerton have a very tender scene, and begin a duet of great charm. Butterfly's share continues rather more vigorously when she is preparing for the marriage chamber, while Pinkerton has a contemplative air, as he admires her pretty movements. The act ends with a strenuous outburst of love and longing, both voices going up to a high C sharp by way of a finish. The second act is in Butterfly's little house, and is divided into two sections without a change of scene, the curtain being lowered merely to mark the passage of time. Butterfly and her faithful maid, Suzuki, begin to feel the pinch of poverty, and the desertion of Pinkerton is soon realized, although Butterfly will not believe it. Butterfly has a characteristic air, vocal but possibly commonplace, and quite typical of young Italy, in which she explains that Pinkerton will come back, how she will see the smoke of his vessel, and watch him climbing the hill from the harbor. Sharpless then comes in, to try and break the news, and brings in a former native lover, a prince, Yamadori, who is evidently quite willing to accept Butterfly as his spouse and make her happy. but she simply bids Sharpless to write and tell his friend Pinkerton that Butterfly and Pinkerton's son await the coming of their lord and master. The first scene ends with Butterfly, the maid, and the child sitting up all the night to watch for the arrival of Pinkerton's vessel. She dresses herself in her wedding garments, and decorates the little house with flowers. The maid and the child soon fall asleep, but as the moonlight floods the scene, Butterfly remains rigid and motionless. A delicate instrumental passage in the music gives the idea of the vigil, in the nature of an intermezzo, and a fresh and pleasing effect is obtained by the use of a humming with closed lips, by the chorus outside, of the melody, supported by the somewhat unusual instrument, a viol d'amore. It is a curious instance, and probably the first, of the use of this bouche fermée effect into an integral part of the orchestration. For a special effect, Puccini also adds to his score in another place the Hungarian instrument a cimbalom, added to the dulcimer. The second scene has a rich, picturesque, and gay opening, the voices of the sailors and the bustle of the vessel's arrival being well shown in the bright music. The end of the tragedy is near, and is very pathetic. Pinkerton is full of remorse, and his wife, Kate, tries to console Butterfly, but the little Japanese girl, with her heart broken when she learns that Pinkerton has passed out of her life, decides to kill herself. She bandages the child's eyes, commits the deed behind a screen, and then staggers forward to die with her arms about the child. With Butterfly's farewell to the child the work ends, as Pinkerton and Sharpless come in to see her die. The music ends with a curious outburst of Japanese character, almost in the nature of an epilogue, and oddly enough it ends on a chord of the sixth in place of the accustomed tonic. All through the music is fresh and interesting, and, provided that by the setting and general interpretation the necessary picturesque atmosphere is established, the opera proves singularly attractive. From the nature of the story, the text reads extremely well in English. In fact, contrary to usual custom, much of the dialogue is strange in Italian, in which mellifluous tongue there is no equivalent, apparently, for whiskey punch or America forever. With this last opera of Puccini we come to the end of the chapter, and with it he may fittingly be left to the verdict of those who shall come after. At the time of writing, no one can say with what the gifted melodist will follow it, whether one of the few themes which have been mentioned as being in his mind will materialize, or whether the Notre Dame of Victor Hugo, or a certain play of Maxim Gorky's, will eventually come to an achievement. Certain it is that the present success of Madamebutterfly, with all its progress on the purely orchestral side, cannot fail to call attention to the earlier works, particularly Le Villi, Edgar, and Manon, as being compositions of singular sincerity. One of Mr. E. A. Bohan's most interesting pieces of criticism, I think, was that written in the Outlook of July 15, 1905, after the first production of Madamebutterfly in England. After making comparison between Puccini and other modern Italians on the subject of musical expression of a theme in general, he deals in characteristic fashion with the dramatic structure of the opera in question. The story itself, as arranged by the Italian librettists, has also grave defects as the subject of an opera. The character of Madame Butterfly herself, with her naive love for the American naval officer, her belief that she is a real American bride, and that he will return to lift her once more into the paradise from which she was so cruelly cast out by his departure, and, when the truth of her marriage is at last revealed, her tragic recourse to the honorable dagger, is a fit subject for music. The emotions to be expressed are mainly lyrical. The other characters are outside musical treatment. F.B. Pinkerton, the American naval officer, is never possessed of any lyrical emotion except when he expresses his remorse for the consequences of his misdeeds. Sharpless, the American consul, who acts as go-between, feels nothing but a vague disquietude, which is easily drowned in a whiskey and soda, and later a rather tender pity for Butterfly. Goro, the marriage broker, is antipathetic to music. Mrs. Pinkerton is the merest of shadows, and of all the cast, the only characters that have thoughts or feelings which can be interpreted by music are Butterfly's faithful maid, Suzuki, and her uncle, Bonzo, who objects on religious grounds to Butterfly's marriage. Puccini has written a love duet for the American naval officer in Madamebutterfly, but as he can make no pretense to any more passionate feeling than a passing sensualism, there is a want of emotional grip in the scene. Then the Japanese environment of the story does not help the composer. Madamebutterfly is only Japanese by fits and starts. When she is emotional, she is a native of modern Italy, the Italy of Mascagni, Leoncavallo, and Puccini himself. It could not be otherwise, for there is no musical local color to be imitated which would serve in passionate scenes. The composer has overcome many of these difficulties with much cleverness. When the stage itself is not musically inspiring, he falls back on his orchestra with the happiest effect. The prosaicness of the European lover and his friend the consul, and the sordid ideas of the Japanese crowd, are covered up by a clever musical ensemble, and the whole drama is drawn together by Puccini's sense of atmosphere. Madamebutterfly herself is a musical creation. The composer could not, of course, make her Japanese, but very poetically he has made her musically naive and sincere. She is a fascinating figure, from the moment when she appears singing of her happiness in having been honored by the American's choice. Her share in the love duet is also well conceived. It is not exactly passionate music, rather ecstatic and sensitive. And the gradual smirching of this butterfly's brightness, until in the end she becomes a wan little figure of tragedy, is subtly expressed in the music. It is not deep music, indeed it should not be, but it has all the more effect because it is thoroughly in character. Even when Madamebutterfly sets her child on the ground and addresses to him her last worship before dying with honor, she is not made to rant by the composer. A German would not have forgotten Isolde's Liebestod. A Mascagni would have remembered his own Santuzza. A Verdi would have metamorphosed the geisha into an Aida. But Puccini has kept to his conception of the character, and she is never once allowed to express herself on the heroic scale. Madamebutterfly is published, like all the operatic works of Puccini, by Ricordi, who, with the vocal score the English translation being by R.H. Elkin, departed from the usual style of binding and issued it in a very decorative Japanesey cover of white linen, with all sorts of tasteful little designs, butterflies and flowers, jotted about on the cover and on the margins. My final paragraph may well be an expression of thanks to those who have been kind enough to assist me with the preparation of my little book. First of all I would thank Signor Puccini, who has cheerfully submitted to two things which he cordially detests: sitting for his photograph on two special occasions, and answering letters. Again, I would thank him for the time he was good enough to spare me when I had the pleasure of meeting him in London during his last two visits. Then to Messrs. Ricordi, who not only have been at considerable pains to verify casts, first performances, and biographical details, but have generously enriched my library of opera scores by those Puccini works which I did not possess. Yet again to Mr. C. Pavone, their representative in London, for considerable assistance most cheerfully rendered; and to my friends Mrs. John Chartres, for helping out my very limited knowledge of Italian, and Mr. Percy Pitt, for allowing me to see his orchestral scores of the Puccini operas. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Ciuffi Galeazzi, Rohnert Park, California. End of Giacomo Puccini by Wakeling Dry.